I walked into my childhood home that crisp November afternoon expecting the usual chaos of Thanksgiving preparation. The smell of roasted turkey filled the air, and I could hear my mother, Patricia, bustling around the kitchen. What I didn't expect was for my entire world to crumble in the span of 88 words. My father, Richard, stood at the head of our dining room table, his chest puffed out with pride as he made his announcement. The family business we had built together, Wellington and Sons Construction, was being sold for $50 million. My siblings Jessica and Brandon erupted in celebration while I sat frozen. When I asked who was buying our legacy, he smiled smugly and said, "Everest Holdings." That's when I dropped the bombshell that would change everything forever. The silence that followed my revelation lasted exactly 3 heartbeats before chaos erupted like a volcano. Richard's face turned the color of cranberry sauce as he slammed his fist on the mahogany table, sending the good china rattling. "That's impossible!" he bellowed, spittle flying from his lips. "You're lying, Martha. You don't have that kind of money." Jessica jumped from her chair so fast it toppled backward, her perfectly curled blonde hair whipping around her shoulders. "This has to be some sick joke," she shrieked, her voice climbing to a pitch that made the crystal glasses sing. "You can't just waltz in here and claim you own some mystery company." Brandon, still clutching his beer bottle, stood slack-jawed beside the buffet. His usual cocky demeanor had evaporated, replaced by the same confused expression he wore in high school algebra class. Wait, he stammered, running his hands through his thinning brown hair. "Are you saying you've been hiding some secret business empire from us?" I reached into my burgundy leather briefcase and withdrew a manila folder thick with legal documents. My hands remained steady despite my racing heart as I spread the papers across the linen tablecloth. Everest Holdings Incorporated filed with the state of Colorado 3 years ago. I announced, pointing to the official seal. Chief Executive Officer Martha Elizabeth Wellington. Patricia emerged from the kitchen, her floral apron dusted with flour, and gasped when she saw the corporate paperwork scattered among the Thanksgiving centerpieces. Her weathered hands flew to her mouth as she read the company registration papers over my shoulder. 3 years. Richard's voice cracked like he was going through puberty again. "You've been planning this betrayal for 3 years. Planning." I laughed, the sound bitter as burnt coffee. "No, Richard, I've been building. While you excluded me from every board meeting, every client dinner, every decision that mattered, I was creating something of my own. Remember when you told me I was too emotional for business? When you said I should focus on finding a husband instead of wasting time with construction contracts?" Jessica's face had gone pale beneath her expensive makeup. "You can't prove any of that," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. I pulled out another document, this one bearing the Harvard Business School letterhead. MBA in Corporate Finance, graduated summa cum laude 2 years ago. I used the inheritance money from Grandpa Wellington to fund my education, while you two were blowing your shares on sports cars and destination weddings. Brandon finally found his voice, though it came out as a squeak. "But where did you get the capital? $50 million doesn't just appear out of nowhere." I started small. I explained, my voice gaining strength with each revelation. I bought struggling construction companies in neighboring states, turned them profitable, using everything Grandpa taught me about the industry. I specialized in sustainable building practices and green technology, while Wellington and Sons stuck with outdated methods. Richard lunged forward, his face twisted with rage. "You stole our trade secrets, our client lists, our proprietary information." "Actually," I said, pulling out another folder, "I built everything using completely different methodologies: solar integration, environmentally friendly materials, worker safety protocols that exceed federal standards. Everything Wellington and Sons refuses to implement because you're too stubborn to change." Patricia stepped closer to the table, her eyes scanning the profit statements and acquisition reports. For the first time in my adult life, she spoke up against her husband. "Richard," she said quietly, "I always knew Martha was the most capable of our children. I've watched her work twice as hard for half the recognition since she was 12 years old." The room fell silent again as my mother's words sank in. Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "This sale is not happening," he declared, his voice shaking with fury. "I'll call my lawyer first thing tomorrow morning and cancel the entire deal." That's when I smiled for the second time that evening, and I could see my expression made everyone deeply uncomfortable. I opened my briefcase wider and began removing document after document, creating a paper trail that stretched across the entire dining table like a legal roadmap. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Richard," I said, my voice steady as granite. "You see, canceling would require both parties to agree to void the contract." Richard grabbed the first page I handed him, his eyes scanning frantically. "These dates," he muttered, his confidence cracking like old paint. "This says I signed 3 weeks ago. October 31st, to be precise." I confirmed, watching his face drain of color. Halloween seemed like an appropriate date for such a frightening mistake. Jessica snatched another document from the pile. "But this can't be binding. Daddy would never sign something this important without reading every clause." I produced a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax. "Audio recording of your father's meeting with his lawyer, Samuel Henderson, dated October 29th. Mr. Henderson advised a thorough contract review and suggested waiting 60 days before signing. Your father's exact words were, 'I don't need some fancy lawyer telling me how to run my business. Where do I sign?'" Brandon knocked over his beer as he reached for the envelope. "You recorded a private meeting." "Colorado is a one-party consent state for recordings," I explained calmly, "and I was present for that meeting via conference call which your father forgot he had scheduled with the anonymous buyer." I pressed play on a small digital recorder. Richard's voice filled the room, loud and boisterous. "This Everest Holdings outfit is probably some group of city slickers who think they can come into our market and wave money around. Well, they picked the wrong family to mess with. I'll take their $50 million and laugh all the way to the bank." The current Richard sitting at our table looked like he wanted to crawl under it and disappear. Patricia's face had gone white as fresh snow. I continued pulling documents from what seemed like an endless briefcase. Bank records showing the debt Wellington and Sons has accumulated over the past 18 months. Turns out, Richard borrowed heavily against the business assets to cover certain family expenses. "What family expenses?" Patricia demanded, her voice sharp as broken glass. I slid a spreadsheet across the table. $200,000 to fund Brandon's restaurant venture Grill Master Supreme, which failed within 8 months. Another $150,000 for Jessica's wedding to Todd, including that destination ceremony in Cabo San Lucas. Jessica's perfectly manicured hands trembled as she read the numbers. "You said that money came from business profits." "It did," Richard admitted reluctantly, "but profits we couldn't really spare." I opened my laptop and connected it to the portable projector I had brought. The dining room wall suddenly displayed a detailed financial analysis. Wellington and Sons is currently operating at a loss of $37,000 per month. Without this sale, you'll be declaring bankruptcy within 6 months. Brandon slumped into his chair like a deflated balloon. "How did you know all this?" "Public records," I answered simply. "Lien filings, credit reports, loan applications, all available to anyone who knows where to look and what questions to ask." The projector screen changed to show surveillance footage from Oakwood Country Club dated November 15th. Richard appeared on screen gesticulating wildly while talking to 3 men in golf attire. "I had no idea you were monitoring my activities," Richard said weakly. "I wasn't monitoring you," I corrected. "The country club's security system automatically archives all common area recordings for insurance purposes. I simply requested copies through proper legal channels after becoming a member myself last year." On screen, Richard was clearly bragging to his golf partners. The audio quality was excellent. "That daughter of mine thinks she's so smart with her fancy college degree. Well, she's about to learn that business is a man's game. I'm selling everything, and she gets nothing. Not 1 red cent." The blood drained completely from Richard's face as his own words came back to haunt him. Patricia had tears streaming down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of rage. Richard Wellington. She said, her voice low and dangerous. In 32 years of marriage, I have never been more ashamed to share your name. The tension in the room crackled like electricity before a thunderstorm. Jessica and Brandon had been whispering urgently in the corner, and now they approached the table with what they clearly thought was a united front. Martha. Jessica began, her voice artificially sweet. We know you're upset about being left out of family decisions, but blood is thicker than water. We can work this out like the loving siblings we are. Brandon nodded enthusiastically, his confidence returning. Yeah, sis, we'll figure out a way to split everything fairly. No need for all this legal drama and hostile takeover stuff. I looked at them both with what I hoped appeared to be genuine consideration. You know what, you're absolutely right. Families should stick together through thick and thin. Their faces brightened immediately, relief washing over them like cool water on a hot day. That's exactly why I'm so disappointed to share this next piece of information. I continued, reaching for another folder. Brandon, would you like to explain to Jessica where the money for your gambling debts came from? The color drained from Brandon's face so fast I thought he might faint. What gambling debts? I don't know what you're talking about. I spread bank statements across the table like a dealer shuffling cards. First National Bank account number ending in 4792. Jessica's trust fund account established by Grandpa Wellington for her 30th birthday. Jessica grabbed the statements, her eyes darting across the columns of numbers. These show transfers to an account I don't recognize. Account number ending in 8156. I supplied helpfully. Registered to Brandon James Wellington. 15 separate transfers over the past 8 months totaling $63,000. $63,000. Jessica's voice rose to a shriek that could shatter windows. Brandon, that was my house down payment. I've been saving for 3 years. Brandon began backing toward the kitchen doorway. I can explain. It's not what it looks like. I pulled out another document. It looks like documentation from Thunder Valley Casino showing Brandon's gambling losses for the same time period. $61,800, almost exactly matching the amount stolen from your trust fund. Stolen? Brandon protested weakly. I borrowed it. I was going to pay it back once my luck turned around. Jessica stood so quickly, her chair fell backward again, but this time she didn't care. My luck? My luck. You stole my future for your addiction. Now hold on, Richard interjected, trying to regain control of the situation. Let's not throw around words like stolen and addiction. Brandon made some poor choices, but he's family. Patricia emerged from the kitchen carrying a bottle of wine, which she opened with more force than necessary. Richard, our son, has a gambling problem. I've known for 2 years. The room went dead silent. You knew. Jessica's voice was barely above a whisper. Patricia poured herself a generous glass before answering. I found the casino chips in his laundry when he stayed here last Christmas. The credit card statements addressed to our house because he was afraid Amanda would see them. The phone calls from collection agencies at all hours. Brandon slumped against the wall, defeated. Mom, you promised you wouldn't tell anyone. I promised I wouldn't tell your father, Patricia corrected. I never promised to protect you from the consequences of stealing from your sister. I produced one final document from the seemingly endless briefcase. Video surveillance from Thunder Valley Casino showing Brandon using Jessica's debit card on 3 separate occasions. The video played on my laptop screen. There was Brandon, clear as day, inserting a card into a slot machine at 2:37 in the morning on a Tuesday. Jessica lunged toward her brother, but Patricia caught her arm. He's not worth assaulting, she said firmly. $63,000, Jessica screamed. I trusted you. I defended you to everyone who said you were irresponsible. I covered for you with Dad when you couldn't make loan payments. Brandon tried one last desperate defense. Martha probably faked all this evidence. She's been planning this revenge for years. You can't trust anything she shows you. I smiled sadly at my brother. The casino surveillance is time-stamped and digitally signed. The bank records are accessible through Jessica's online account, which she can verify right now using her phone. The credit card statements were mailed directly to this address, which means Mom has the physical copies upstairs in her filing cabinet. Patricia nodded grimly. Drawer labeled Brandon's Problems, right behind my recipe collection. Jessica turned to face Brandon, tears streaming down her cheeks, but her voice was steel. I want every penny back, with interest, and if you ever come near my financial accounts again, I'll have you arrested for identity theft. The sibling alliance had crumbled faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. The revelation about Brandon's theft had left everyone emotionally drained, but I wasn't finished. Patricia refilled her wine glass and settled into her chair with the determination of someone preparing for a long confession. There's something else you all need to know. She announced, her voice carrying a strength I hadn't heard since childhood. I haven't just been a passive observer in this family drama. Richard looked at his wife with confusion. What do you mean? Patricia reached into the antique secretary desk behind her chair and withdrew a thick manila envelope. I mean, I've been actively helping Martha gather information about our family's finances for over a year. The shock on Richard's face was absolute. His mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to croak out a single word. What? Copy after copy of bank statements. Patricia continued emptying the envelope's contents onto the table. Recordings of your phone conversations with clients, photographs of documents you thought you had hidden in your office safe. I felt a surge of gratitude toward my mother that threatened to overwhelm me. Mom helped me understand exactly how deep the financial problems went. I explained to my stunned siblings. She was the one who discovered the loans against the business assets. Patricia stood and walked to the china cabinet, retrieving a small digital recorder identical to mine. Would you like to hear some highlights from the past 18 months? She pressed play and Richard's voice filled the room again, but this conversation was different. He was talking to someone on the phone, his tone casual and dismissive. Martha thinks she's so smart with that fancy MBA, his recorded voice said, but business isn't about book learning. It's about instinct and courage qualities women just don't possess. That's why God made men to run companies and women to support them. Patricia fast-forwarded through the recording. Here's another good one from your conversation with Bill Morrison at the hardware store. Richard's voice continued. I keep telling Martha she needs to focus on finding a husband and giving me grandchildren instead of wasting time pretending she understands construction. A woman's place is in the home, not on a job site telling grown men what to do. Jessica gasped audibly. Even Brandon looked uncomfortable as he heard his father's words. Patricia wasn't finished. She produced another recording device, this one smaller and more sophisticated. This is from the family barbecue last 4th of July. Martha wasn't invited, remember, because you said it was for immediate family only. She pressed play, and the sounds of laughter and conversation filled the room. Then Richard's voice cut through the background noise clearly. The truth is, I'm embarrassed by Martha's behavior. All this education and career nonsense makes our family look bad. People are starting to ask why I can't control my own daughter. A woman who doesn't know her place reflects poorly on her father's leadership. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt tears stinging my eyes, not from sadness, but from vindication. Finally, everyone could hear what I had endured for years. Mom, I whispered, why didn't you defend me during those conversations? Patricia's face crumpled with guilt and regret. Because I was a coward, she admitted. I was afraid of your father's anger, afraid of disrupting the peace, afraid of standing up for what was right. But listening to those recordings later, hearing how cruel and unfair his words were, I knew I had to do something. She walked over and placed her hand on my shoulder. So I started documenting everything. Every discriminatory comment, every financial irregularity, every instance where you were treated differently than your brothers. I may have been silent then, but I wasn't going to let injustice continue. Richard found his voice finally, though it shook with emotion. Patricia, you've been spying on me for over a year. I've been protecting our daughter from your prejudice, she corrected firmly. Someone had to. Patricia returned to the secretary desk and retrieved one final item, a legal document bearing the seal of the state of Colorado. Petition for divorce. She announced, placing it in front of Richard. Filed this morning with the Arapahoe County District Court. The silence that followed could have been measured in geological time. You're divorcing me. Richard's voice was barely audible. I'm divorcing the man who would rather destroy his own daughter than admit a woman could be successful in business, Patricia replied. I'm claiming half of all marital assets, including this house, and whatever remains of Wellington and Sons after Martha's acquisition. Jessica stared at our mother with newfound respect. Mom, I had no idea you were this strong. Neither did I, Patricia admitted. But watching Martha build her own empire while being dismissed and belittled by her own family taught me that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when it's terrifying. Brandon, still reeling from his own exposure, managed to ask, "What happens now?" Patricia smiled for the first time all evening, and it transformed her entire face. Now we eat Thanksgiving dinner and celebrate the fact that truth finally came to light. Martha, would you like to say grace? Just as we were beginning to process the magnitude of Patricia's revelations, the doorbell rang with the distinctive three-chime melody I remembered from childhood. Everyone froze as if playing a game of musical statues, none of us expecting additional guests on this already explosive Thanksgiving. Patricia wiped her eyes and smoothed her apron. "I'll get it," she said. But before she could move, the front door opened and familiar voices echoed through the hallway. "Hello, family," called a deep baritone voice that made Richard's face go even paler. "Hope we're not too late for the festivities." Uncle Thomas strode into the dining room with his characteristic confidence, wearing an expensive charcoal gray suit that screamed, "Successful attorney." Behind him followed his son, David, my cousin carrying 2 leather briefcases and wearing the kind of smile that suggested he knew exactly what chaos he was walking into. "Thomas," Richard stammered, rising from his chair, "what are you doing here? We weren't expecting you until Christmas." "Change of plans," Thomas replied cheerfully, setting down his briefcase with practiced precision. "David and I had some urgent business to discuss with the family, something about corporate acquisitions and legal documentation." Jessica looked back and forth between the newcomers and me, her expression growing more confused by the minute. "What kind of business could you possibly have with our family crisis?" David opened his briefcase and withdrew a stack of documents bound in blue legal folders. "The kind of business that involves representing Everest Holdings in all corporate matters," he announced with satisfaction. The room erupted again, but this time Richard's shock was so profound he actually staggered backward into his chair. "You're working with Martha?" Brandon asked weakly. "Working with her?" Thomas laughed heartily. "Son, I've been her silent partner and chief legal counsel since she incorporated Everest Holdings 3 years ago." I stood and embraced my uncle, feeling genuine warmth for the first time all day. Thomas believed in my vision when my own father refused to even listen to my business proposals. David set his briefcases on the table next to mine, creating what looked like a legal command center. I've been managing Martha's books, structuring her acquisitions, and handling all financial compliance since day one. My accounting firm has been working exclusively with Everest Holdings for 2 years. Patricia poured 2 more glasses of wine and handed them to our unexpected guests. "I'm so grateful you both supported Martha when her own family failed her." Thomas accepted the wine and raised his glass toward me. "Supporting Martha was the smartest business decision I've made in 20 years of practicing law. She's generated more legitimate profit than any client I've ever represented." Richard finally found his voice, though it came out as a hoarse whisper. "But Thomas, you're my brother. We built our careers together. How could you go behind my back like this?" "Go behind your back." Thomas's voice turned cold as winter wind. "Richard, I approached you 2 years ago with a proposal to bring Martha into Wellington and Sons as a full partner. You laughed and told me women belonged in the kitchen, not the boardroom. I remembered that conversation vividly. I had been working late in the office when Thomas arrived for what I thought was a casual family visit. Instead, he had spent 3 hours trying to convince Richard to recognize my potential and include me in company leadership. David pulled out a thick folder labeled Wellington Family Meeting Minutes and opened it to a specific page. November 14th, 2023. Uncle Richard's exact words were, "Martha can type invoices and answer phones, but I'll never let a woman make decisions that could destroy what 3 generations of Wellington men have built." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. Thomas continued, his attorney voice in full effect. That's when I realized my brother was never going to change his mind about women in business. So I decided to help Martha prove him wrong by building her own empire. We started small. David added, pulling out acquisition reports. A struggling concrete company in Fort Collins that was about to declare bankruptcy. Martha saw potential where everyone else saw failure. I smiled at the memory. Rocky Mountain Concrete Materials. 23 employees who hadn't been paid in 6 weeks. I bought it for $80,000 and turned it profitable within 4 months. Thomas nodded proudly. Then came Mountain View Development in Colorado Springs, another company on the verge of collapse due to poor management and outdated practices. Martha implemented solar panel integration and green building techniques that reduced operating costs by 35%. David continued. Suddenly, we had clients lining up for environmentally conscious construction services. Richard's face had gone through several color changes during this conversation, settling on a sickly green that matched the Brussels sprouts cooling on the stove. "How many companies does she own now?" Jessica asked quietly. David consulted his tablet. 17 companies across 4 states. Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico. Everything from concrete suppliers to heavy equipment rental to residential development firms. 17. Brandon's voice cracked like he was 13 again. Thomas smiled with obvious pride. And every acquisition was carefully researched, financially sound, and legally bulletproof. Martha doesn't take risks. She calculates opportunities. I pulled out my own tablet and connected it to the projector again. Some of those companies have been competing directly with Wellington and Sons for the past 18 months. The screen displayed a map showing the locations of all my businesses with Wellington and Sons marked in red at the center. My companies formed a nearly complete circle around Richard's territory. Superior Building Supply has been underbidding Wellington and Sons on materials for 8 months, I explained. Rocky Mountain Development won the Morrison Township contract that Richard expected to get automatically. Richard's face crumpled as he realized the scope of what I had accomplished. "You've been stealing our clients." "I've been offering better services at competitive prices," I corrected. "Something Wellington and Sons stopped doing years ago when you became complacent." Thomas pulled out one final document, this one bearing official court seals. Which brings us to the real reason David and I are here today. He handed the papers to Richard with ceremonial formality. Legal notification that Patricia Wellington has filed for divorce and is claiming half of all marital assets. As her attorney, I'm here to ensure her rights are protected throughout the process. Richard stared at the divorce papers as if they were written in a foreign language. David opened his second briefcase and withdrew another legal document. And as Martha's corporate counsel, I'm here to serve notice that Richard Wellington is being sued for emotional damages, discrimination, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The final blow had been delivered, and my father looked like a man who had just realized his entire world was crumbling around him. With my laptop already connected to the projector, I decided it was time for the full revelation of what I had built over the past 3 years. The dining room wall became my presentation screen as I opened the Everest Holdings corporate dashboard. Since we're all here and all the secrets are coming out anyway, let me show you exactly what I've accomplished while being dismissed as too emotional for business. The screen displayed the Everest Holdings logo, followed by a comprehensive portfolio overview. Richard leaned forward in his chair, squinting at the numbers as if they might change if he looked hard enough. 17 companies, as David mentioned. I began clicking through acquisition reports. But let me break down the specifics so everyone understands the scope of this operation. The first slide showed Rocky Mountain Concrete Materials, purchased for $80,000, now generating $4.2 million annually. We supply concrete to 12 construction companies across the Front Range, including 3 that used to buy exclusively from Wellington and Sons. Jessica gasped as the profit margins became clear. $4 million from an $80,000 investment. Green building materials and energy-efficient production processes, I explained. Clients pay premium prices for environmentally responsible construction supplies. Thomas nodded approvingly. Martha identified market trends 5 years before her competitors caught on. The next slide revealed Mountain View Development. Second acquisition purchased for $1.6 million. Current annual revenue $8.7 million. We specialize in affordable housing projects that meet LEED certification standards. Brandon was staring at the screen as if hypnotized. $8.7 million. That's more than Wellington and Sons makes in 2 years. Which brings us to Superior Building Supply. I continued advancing to the next presentation slide. Purchased 18 months ago for $3.4 million. Annual revenue $12.9 million. Richard's mouth fell open. $12.9 million. That's impossible. No supply company in Colorado generates that kind of revenue. David chuckled and opened his briefcase again. Unless they're supplying materials for major infrastructure projects. Martha secured exclusive contracts with the Colorado Department of Transportation for highway renovation projects. I clicked to the next slide showing photographs of road construction sites across the state. Superior Building Supply provides all concrete asphalt and steel materials for Interstate 25 improvements from Denver to Colorado Springs. Patricia refilled her wine glass, shaking her head in amazement. Martha, how did you even know about these government contracts? Research. I answered simply. I spent 6 months studying federal and state infrastructure budgets, identifying which projects would require massive material supplies over the next 5 years. Thomas raised his glass in a toast. While Wellington and Sons was focusing on small residential jobs, Martha was positioning herself for multi-million-dollar government contracts. The presentation continued with slide after slide of successful acquisitions. Alpine Equipment Rental generating $6.3 million annually from heavy machinery leasing. Front Range Residential Building, affordable housing developments across 3 counties. Western Slope Commercial constructing office buildings and retail centers. But here's my favorite acquisition, I said, clicking to a slide that made Richard's face go completely white. The screen displayed the logo for Precision Construction Services, a company name that clearly meant something significant to my father. Precision Construction was Wellington and Sons' biggest competitor for commercial contracts in the Denver metro area. I explained. They consistently underbid us and won projects through superior efficiency and modern equipment. Richard nodded weakly. We lost the Highlands Ranch Shopping Center contract to them last year. Cost us $2.8 million in potential revenue. Well, I said with a smile. Now Precision Construction is part of the Everest Holdings family. Purchased 6 months ago for $14.7 million. Current annual revenue $26.4 million. The silence in the room was profound. David pulled out a calculator and began adding figures. 17 companies with combined annual revenues exceeding $80 million. $80 million! Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. I advanced to the final slide showing Everest Holdings' consolidated financial statement. $83.7 million in annual revenue. Operating costs of $31.2 million. Net profit of $52.5 million annually. Brandon slumped forward and put his head in his hands. "You're worth $50 million a year." "More than that," Thomas interjected proudly. "When you calculate the total value of all assets, equipment, real estate, and ongoing contracts, Everest Holdings is worth approximately $137 million. Richard looked like he might faint. $137 million. I clicked back to the map showing all my company locations. And it's growing. We're currently negotiating acquisitions in Arizona and Utah that would expand our territory and add another $40 million in annual revenue. Patricia stood and walked around the table to embrace me. "Martha, I had no idea the scope of what you'd accomplished. This is incredible. It's also completely independent of Wellington and Sons," David added pointedly. "Every acquisition was researched, financed, and executed using Martha's own resources and business connections." I looked directly at Richard as I delivered the final revelation. Not $1, not one client contact, not one piece of proprietary information came from Wellington and Sons. Everything I built was accomplished despite being excluded from the family business, not because of any advantage it might have provided. Thomas cleared his throat and pulled out a newspaper clipping from his briefcase. "Speaking of which, this was published in the Denver Business Journal 6 months ago." He handed the article to Richard, whose hands trembled as he read the headline, "Mysterious Female CEO Transforms Regional Construction Industry." The article featured a large photograph of me standing in front of one of my commercial development projects, wearing a hard hat and safety vest, clearly in my element on a construction site. Richard stared at the photograph for a long moment before looking up at me with something that might have been recognition for the first time in my adult life. The business revelations had left everyone stunned, but I knew the time had come to address the deeper wounds that had driven me to build my empire in the first place. The financial success was satisfying, but the emotional scars needed healing before our family could move forward. All of these numbers and acquisitions tell one story. I began my voice becoming softer but more intense. But there's another story that needs to be told. The story of why I felt compelled to prove myself by building something entirely separate from this family. I walked over to the antique china cabinet and retrieved a small recording device I had hidden there during dinner preparation. I've been documenting conversations for much longer than just the past year. Patricia looked surprised. "Martha, when did you start recording family interactions?" "My senior year of high school." I answered, pressing play on the device. My guidance counselor, Mrs. Anderson, suggested I start keeping evidence after I broke down in her office one day. The recording quality was poor, but Richard's voice was unmistakably clear. "Martha thinks she's going to college for business. I told her she's wasting my money. Women don't belong in boardrooms. They belong at home raising children and supporting their husbands' careers." The current Richard winced as he heard his younger self speaking. "That was from the family dinner when I announced my acceptance to Harvard Business School," I explained. I was 18 years old and had just received a partial scholarship to one of the most prestigious programs in the country. I fast-forwarded through the recording to find another section. This time, Richard's voice was even more dismissive. If Martha wants to play businesswoman, she can type letters and file paperwork. But she'll never be involved in real decision-making. The construction industry is too dangerous and complicated for female emotions. Jessica covered her mouth with her hands. "Martha, I don't remember Dad being that harsh." "Because you weren't the target," I replied simply. "These conversations happened whenever you and Brandon weren't around. Private moments when Richard felt free to express his true feelings about women in business." Thomas and David exchanged glances clearly, hearing some of these recordings for the first time, despite our long business relationship. I played another recording, this one from my college graduation party. Here's Richard explaining to our extended family why my MBA didn't matter. His voice filled the room again. "Sure, Martha got good grades, but book learning isn't the same as real-world experience. Men have natural leadership instincts that women simply don't possess. That's why every successful construction company is run by men. Brandon looked genuinely uncomfortable. Dad, did you really believe those things? Before Richard could answer, I played one more recording that made everyone in the room go silent. This one was from just 2 years ago during the family Christmas party. Martha keeps pushing to be involved in company strategy meetings, Richard's recorded voice said, but I can't have a woman questioning my decisions in front of clients and employees. It would undermine my authority and make the whole company look weak. The pain in my chest was as fresh as if I had heard those words for the first time. Do you know what it's like to hear your own father say that your gender makes you fundamentally incapable of the work you love? Patricia had tears streaming down her face. Martha, why didn't you tell me how bad it was? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Because you were there for most of these conversations, Mom. You heard him say these things and you never once defended me or contradicted him. The guilt on Patricia's face was evident. I was afraid of confrontation. I thought if I stayed quiet, the situation would improve on its own. It didn't improve, I said firmly. It got worse. So I started seeing a therapist to deal with the emotional damage these constant dismissals were causing. I pulled out a thick folder from my briefcase. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, licensed clinical psychologist. 3 years of therapy sessions focused on overcoming internalized doubt and building confidence despite systematic discouragement from family members. Thomas looked at the therapy records with professional interest. Martha, are these documents part of your legal case? They're part of the evidence for emotional damages, David confirmed. Systematic discrimination and psychological abuse create measurable mental health impacts. I opened the folder and read from one of Dr. Mitchell's session notes. Patient exhibits classic symptoms of complex family trauma, including persistent self-doubt, perfectionist tendencies, and fear of failure. Despite exceptional academic and professional achievements, ongoing family invalidation has created deep-seated beliefs about her own competence and worth. The room was silent except for the sound of Patricia crying softly. 3 years of therapy to unlearn the lessons this family taught me about women in business. I continued. 3 years to rebuild my confidence enough to start Everest Holdings. 3 years to stop hearing Richard's voice in my head every time I tried to make an important decision. I pulled out another document from the therapy folder. This is from my breakthrough session 18 months ago. Dr. Mitchell helped me realize that proving myself to Richard was never going to be possible, because his prejudices weren't based on my capabilities. They were based on his fundamental belief that women are inferior in business. Richard finally spoke, his voice barely audible. Martha, I never meant to hurt you that deeply. But you did. I replied without anger, just sadness. Every dismissive comment, every exclusion from meetings, every time you praised Brandon's mediocre efforts while ignoring my exceptional ones, all of it added up to a clear message that my gender made me worthless in your eyes. Jessica stood and walked around the table to embrace me. Martha, I'm so sorry. I had no idea how much pain you were carrying. The ironic part, I said, returning her embrace, is that all that rejection and dismissal motivated me to build something bigger and more successful than Wellington & Sons could ever be. Richard's prejudice accidentally created his own worst nightmare, a daughter who proved him completely wrong about women in business. Thomas raised his wine glass. And that dear family is why we're all here today, celebrating Martha's triumph instead of mourning Richard's mistakes. The emotional revelations had left everyone drained, but David cleared his throat and opened his second briefcase with the efficiency of an accountant who understood that numbers often told stories more clearly than words. I'm afraid the therapy and discrimination issues aren't the only legal problems facing this family, he announced, pulling out boxes of financial documents. During my due diligence investigation for Martha's acquisition, I discovered some serious irregularities in Wellington & Sons business practices. Richard's face went from pale to green as David began spreading federal tax forms across the table. These are Wellington & Sons tax returns for the past 5 years, David explained, pointing to specific line items highlighted in yellow. Notice anything interesting about the deductions claimed for business expenses? Thomas put on his reading glasses and leaned over the documents. As an attorney, he immediately spotted the problems. Richard, these personal expenses are listed as business costs. What kind of personal expenses? Patricia asked, moving closer to examine the papers. David pulled out a calculator and began totaling figures. Jessica's wedding expenses listed as client entertainment. Brandon's failed restaurant investment classified as business development opportunity. Richard's country club membership marked as professional networking costs. I watched my father's face crumble as David continued the financial autopsy. The family vacation to Hawaii last year recorded as a business conference. The new boat Richard bought labeled as company equipment for client meetings. Even Patricia's kitchen renovation was somehow classified as office improvement. Brandon squirmed in his chair. Is that illegal? Fraudulent tax reporting is a federal crime, Thomas answered grimly. The IRS takes a very dim view of personal expenses claimed as business deductions. David opened another folder, this one containing correspondence from government agencies. The Internal Revenue Service has been building an investigation into Wellington and Sons for the past 18 months. Richard's voice came out as a strangled whisper. 18 months! They started with a routine audit triggered by the unusually high ratio of claimed business expenses to actual revenue, David explained. But the audit uncovered systematic misreporting that prompted a full criminal investigation. Patricia grabbed Richard's arm. Criminal investigation, what does that mean? Thomas answered in his attorney voice. It means Richard could face federal charges for tax evasion fraud and filing false financial statements. I pulled out another set of documents from my seemingly endless briefcase. It gets worse. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration has been documenting workplace safety violations at Wellington and Sons for over 2 years. The OSHA reports made for disturbing reading: missing safety equipment, inadequate worker training, failure to report workplace injuries, substandard scaffolding, and improper handling of hazardous materials. 3 separate incidents where employees were injured due to safety violations. I read from the reports. Jake Morrison fell from a scaffold that wasn't properly secured. Linda Peterson was exposed to asbestos during a renovation project without proper protective equipment. Tom Bradley suffered a back injury using equipment that should have been replaced years ago. Richard tried to interrupt. Those were isolated incidents. Accidents happen in construction. Accidents that could have been prevented with proper safety protocols, I corrected. OSHA has been preparing to shut down Wellington and Sons operations until all violations are corrected. David opened his laptop and connected to the wireless internet. The estimated cost of bringing Wellington and Sons into compliance with federal safety regulations is $4.7 million. $4.7 million, Jessica gasped. Where would that money come from? It wouldn't, I answered simply. Wellington and Sons doesn't have $4.7 million available for safety upgrades. The company would have to declare bankruptcy before completing the required improvements. Thomas pulled out another legal document, which brings us to the environmental violations. The Environmental Protection Agency report was even more damning than the OSHA findings. Improper disposal of construction waste, contamination of groundwater at 3 different job sites, and failure to obtain required permits for projects involving wetlands. The EPA is demanding $8.2 million in cleanup costs and fines, Thomas announced. Patricia looked like she might faint. $8.2 million. For environmental damage that will take decades to repair. I confirmed. Wellington and Sons has been cutting corners on environmental compliance for years to save money on proper disposal and permits. Richard finally found his voice. Martha, if you knew about all these violations, why didn't you report them sooner? The room went silent as everyone waited for my answer. Because I've been quietly paying the fines and cleanup costs for over a year, I revealed. Everest Holdings has been covering Wellington and Sons' legal obligations to prevent federal charges against the entire family. The shocked silence stretched for several minutes. "You've been protecting us?" Brandon asked weakly. "I've been protecting innocent employees and preventing environmental damage," I clarified. "Your choices created these problems, but shutting down Wellington and Sons would have put 63 people out of work right before Christmas last year." David pulled out receipts and payment confirmations. "Martha has paid $2.4 million to keep Wellington and Sons in compliance with federal regulations over the past 14 months. $2.4 million. Richard's voice was barely audible. Thomas nodded approvingly. "My niece has been cleaning up your messes while you've been excluding her from the family business." I looked directly at Richard as I delivered the final piece of information. "The only reason you're not facing criminal charges right now is because Everest Holdings assumed financial responsibility for all violations and committed to ongoing compliance monitoring." Patricia walked over and embraced me tightly. "Martha, you saved this entire family from destruction." "I saved the employees and the environment," I corrected gently. "But yes, protecting Wellington and Sons workers meant protecting the family reputation as well." David closed his laptop and packed away the financial documents, which is why Martha's acquisition of Wellington and Sons is actually a rescue operation disguised as a business transaction. The weight of this revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Richard had been so focused on excluding me from the family business that he never realized I was the only thing standing between his company and complete collapse. Just as the financial revelations were sinking in, I decided it was time to address the human element that mattered most to me. The employees whose livelihoods had been affected by Richard's poor management decisions. "The money and legal issues are important," I said, walking back to my briefcase, "but there's something else that influenced my decision to acquire Wellington and Sons." I pulled out a thick manila folder stuffed with handwritten letters and employment applications. These arrived at my office over the past 6 months. Patricia looked curious. "What kind of letters?" "Employment applications," I answered, spreading them across the table like a hand of cards, "from current Wellington and Sons employees who want to work for Everest Holdings instead." Richard's face went through another color change as he recognized some of the handwriting on the applications. I picked up the first letter written on lined paper in careful block letters. "This is from Jake Morrison, your foreman for the past 12 years. I began reading aloud, "Dear Ms. Wellington, I am writing to request employment with Everest Holdings. Working for your father has become increasingly difficult due to his refusal to invest in proper safety equipment and his tendency to blame workers for management failures. I have heard that your companies prioritize employee safety and fair treatment qualities that have been missing from Wellington and Sons for several years." The silence in the room was profound as Jake's words sank in. "Jake has been with the company since before I graduated high school," Richard said weakly. I picked up another letter, this one typed on pink stationery. "This is from Carol Henderson, your office manager and bookkeeper. Dear Martha, I read, I have watched your father's business practices become increasingly questionable over the past 3 years. He has asked me to hide billing errors from clients, misrepresent project timelines, and falsify expense reports for tax purposes. As someone who has worked in accounting for 25 years, I cannot continue to be associated with these unethical practices. I would be honored to work for a company that operates with integrity and honesty." Patricia gasped. "Carol wrote that." "She's been keeping the books for Wellington and Sons since before you and Richard were married," I confirmed. "Carol has seen every financial irregularity, every questionable decision, every corner cut to save money." Thomas leaned forward with interest. "What other employees have applied to work for Everest Holdings?" I shuffled through the applications, pulling out several more. Bobby Martinez from the electrical crew, Susan Chen from project management, Mike O'Brien from equipment maintenance, and Linda Peterson from quality control. "That's almost the entire management team," Brandon observed. "It gets worse," I continued pulling out a longer document. This is a petition signed by 41 of Wellington and Sons' 63 employees, requesting that I take over management of the company. I handed the petition to Richard, whose hands shook as he read the list of signatures. 41 employees, he repeated in disbelief. David opened his laptop again. I conducted exit interviews with 12 employees who quit Wellington and Sons over the past year. Would you like to hear some of their feedback about management? Without waiting for an answer, he began reading from his notes. Unsafe working conditions, no investment in modern equipment, constant yelling and blame from management failure to provide adequate training, and a general sense that employee welfare was not a priority. I pulled out another folder containing photographs. These are pictures employees sent me showing safety violations they were forced to work with. The photographs showed rusty scaffolding, broken safety equipment, exposed electrical wiring, and workers using damaged tools that should have been replaced years ago. This photo from Linda Peterson shows the asbestos exposure incident I mentioned earlier. I explained. She was told to remove ceiling tiles without proper protective equipment because Richard didn't want to pay for an abatement contractor. Patricia covered her mouth in horror. Richard, you could have killed her. The most telling feedback, David continued, came from employees who said they stayed with Wellington and Sons only because they hoped Martha would eventually take over and improve working conditions. I smiled sadly at this revelation. They had more faith in my leadership potential than my own family did. Thomas raised an important point. Martha, what happens to these employees under your ownership? Everyone keeps their job, I announced firmly, but with significant improvements to working conditions, safety protocols, and compensation packages. I pulled out a comprehensive employee benefits plan I had been developing. 20% salary increases across the board, full health insurance coverage, retirement planning assistance, and mandatory safety training with modern equipment. 20% increases, Richard asked weakly. Everest Holdings operates on the principle that well-treated employees are more productive, more loyal, and less likely to cause safety incidents. I explained. Investing in workers saves money in the long run through reduced turnover, fewer accidents, and higher quality work. David nodded approvingly. Martha's other companies have employee satisfaction ratings 90% higher than industry averages. I pulled out one final letter, this one written on official letterhead. This is from the Colorado Construction Workers Union, thanking me for my commitment to employee safety and fair labor practices. The union letter praised Everest Holdings for exceeding federal requirements and setting new standards for worker treatment in the regional construction industry. The union has offered to help train Wellington and Sons employees on new safety protocols and modern construction techniques. I explained, something they never offered to do under Richard's management. Patricia wiped away tears that had been flowing steadily for the past hour. Martha, you're not just saving the business, you're saving people's lives. That's always been the most important consideration, I confirmed. Profits matter, but not more than human safety and dignity. Richard looked at the employee applications spread across the table, finally understanding how completely he had failed as a leader. They really want to work for you instead of me. They want to work for someone who values their contributions and protects their welfare, I clarified gently. Leadership isn't about control and fear. It's about creating environments where people can do their best work safely. The transformation in Richard's expression suggested he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistakes. Just as the weight of the employee situation was settling over everyone, the doorbell rang again with an urgency that suggested our Thanksgiving revelations were far from over. This time, Patricia didn't even have a chance to move before the front door opened and multiple voices filled the hallway. Martha Wellington called a woman's voice with the authority of someone accustomed to public speaking. We hope we're not interrupting, but we have some exciting news to share. Mayor Rebecca Johnson entered our dining room like she owned the place, followed by City Planning Director Michael Santos and Chamber of Commerce President Angela Foster. All three were dressed in their finest business attire and carrying official-looking folders. Mayor Johnson. Patricia stammered, clearly confused by this unexpected parade of local officials. "What brings you to our home on Thanksgiving evening?" The mayor smiled broadly and pulled a bottle of champagne from her oversized purse. "We're here to congratulate Martha on being selected as the lead contractor for the most ambitious development project in our city's history." Richard looked like he might slide under the table and disappear entirely. "What development project?" Jessica asked, clearly speaking for everyone in the room. Michael Santos stepped forward and opened his folder with ceremonial flourish. "The Downtown Revitalization Initiative, $200 million in federal funding to transform 12 city blocks of declining commercial space into a mixed-use development that will serve as a regional economic hub." Angela Foster nodded enthusiastically. 800 permanent jobs, affordable housing for 600 families, retail space for local businesses, and a community center with educational facilities. I felt a surge of pride as the officials continued their presentation. This project had been my secret focus for over 18 months, and seeing it come together felt like validation of everything I had worked toward. Martha submitted the winning proposal 6 months ago. Mayor Johnson explained to my stunned family. Her innovative approach to sustainable development, community engagement, and economic impact exceeded every other bid by a substantial margin. David pulled out his tablet and connected to our dining room projector, which was getting quite a workout this evening. "Here are the architectural plans Martha developed in collaboration with the City Planning Department." The wall displayed detailed blueprints showing a completely transformed downtown area, modern apartment buildings mixed with green spaces, solar-powered commercial centers connected by pedestrian walkways, and community gardens integrated throughout the development. "This is incredible," Patricia whispered, studying the architectural renderings. "Martha, when did you have time to plan something this elaborate?" "Evenings and weekends for the past year and a half," I answered. "While everyone assumed I was just working late at some meaningless job." Thomas smiled with obvious pride. "Martha has been attending every city council meeting, every planning commission hearing, and every community input session related to this project." Michael Santos pulled out a thick binder full of community feedback forms. Martha didn't just submit a development proposal. She spent months talking to local residents, business owners, and community leaders to understand what kind of development would actually serve their needs. "Most contractors submit generic plans and hope for the best," Angela Foster added. Martha created a proposal specifically designed to address our community's unique challenges and opportunities. Mayor Johnson opened the champagne and began pouring glasses for everyone. The Federal Review Committee was so impressed with Martha's community-centered approach that they're considering using her model as a template for similar projects across the region. Richard managed to find his voice, though it came out as a croak. "The city is giving Martha a $200 million construction contract." "Not giving," Michael Santos corrected firmly. "Martha earned this contract through superior planning, innovative design, and proven track record of successful project completion." I accepted a glass of champagne and raised it toward the city officials. "This project represents everything I believe about responsible development, creating economic opportunities while preserving community character and environmental sustainability." David advanced to the next slide, showing the projected economic impact of the development. 800 permanent jobs with average salaries 15% above regional standards, local business opportunities that will generate an additional $50 million in annual economic activity. $50 million, Brandon repeated weakly. "The ripple effect of major development projects extends far beyond the initial construction," Angela Foster explained. "New residents need groceries, restaurants, retail services, professional offices, and recreational facilities. All of that economic activity benefits existing local businesses." Mayor Johnson turned to address Richard directly. "Mr. Wellington, I have to tell you that your company was never considered for this project. The City Planning Committee felt that Wellington and Sons lacked the vision and capabilities necessary for a development of this scope. The brutal honesty of that statement hit Richard like a physical blow. However, she continued, Martha's proposal specifically included provisions for involving local contractors as subcontractors and suppliers, which means Wellington and Sons could potentially benefit from the project under her leadership. Thomas pulled out another document from his briefcase. The city has also awarded Martha the contract for Phase 2 of the project, which involves renovating the historic district and creating a cultural arts center. Phase 2, Patricia asked. Another $80 million in development funding. Michael Santos confirmed. Martha was the only contractor who demonstrated understanding of historic preservation requirements and cultural sensitivity. I felt a warm glow of satisfaction as the scope of my community involvement became clear to my family. Historic preservation requires specialized knowledge of period-appropriate materials and construction techniques. I've been studying 19th century building methods for 2 years. David switched to photographs of my other historic renovation projects. Martha has successfully restored 4 historic buildings across Colorado, all completed on time and under budget, while maintaining historical accuracy. The Colorado Historical Society has endorsed Martha's approach to preservation-based development, Angela Foster added. She's become the go-to contractor for projects that require balancing modern functionality with historic integrity. Mayor Johnson raised her glass in a toast. To Martha Wellington, whose vision and dedication will transform our community for generations to come. As everyone clinked glasses, I caught Richard staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. It might have been respect, or perhaps just the dawning realization of how completely he had misjudged my capabilities. There's one more thing, Mayor Johnson said, pulling out an official-looking certificate. The City Council voted unanimously to present Martha with the key to the city at next month's council meeting, recognizing her contributions to economic development and community improvement. The key to the city. I had dreamed of community recognition since childhood, but I never imagined it would come through accomplishments my own father had tried to prevent. Patricia wiped away fresh tears. Martha, I'm so proud of what you've accomplished. The most remarkable thing, Michael Santos observed, is that Martha developed these community connections while being systematically excluded from her family's business network. She built relationships and earned trust entirely on her own merit. Richard looked down at his hands, clearly processing the implications of what he was hearing. His daughter had not only succeeded despite his efforts to hold her back, but had achieved recognition and opportunities that were far beyond anything Wellington and Sons could have offered. The community celebration was reaching its peak when the doorbell rang for what felt like the 100th time that evening. Everyone looked toward the hallway with a mixture of curiosity and exhaustion, wondering what other surprises this Thanksgiving could possibly hold. I'll get it, I said, setting down my champagne glass and walking toward the front door. I knew who it would be, and my heart raced with anticipation mixed with nervousness about introducing him to this chaotic family scene. I opened the door to find Marcus Chen standing on the porch, holding a gorgeous bouquet of autumn flowers in one hand and rolled architectural plans in the other. His warm brown eyes searched my face with concern. I got your text about family drama, he said softly. I brought flowers for your mom and the latest design revisions for the affordable housing component. Perfect timing, I said, taking his hand and leading him into the dining room where everyone was still processing the community development revelations. Everyone, I announced, feeling my cheeks flush with happiness. I'd like you to meet Marcus Chen, my partner in both business and life. The room went silent as Marcus set down the flowers and architectural plans, then wrapped his arm around my waist with comfortable familiarity. Partner? Jessica asked, clearly surprised by this development. I've been wondering when Martha would finally introduce us, Patricia said, standing to embrace Marcus warmly. She's mentioned you in our phone conversations, but always changed the subject when I asked for details. Marcus smiled that brilliant grin that had first caught my attention at a sustainable architecture conference 18 months ago. I can understand her reluctance to share family news given the circumstances she's described. Thomas raised his glass toward Marcus. Are you the architect responsible for those innovative building designs in Martha's development projects? Guilty as charged, Marcus replied, accepting a glass of champagne from Mayor Johnson. Martha and I have been collaborating on sustainable construction techniques that reduce environmental impact while cutting long-term operating costs. David nodded approvingly. Marcus's firm, Chen Environmental Design, has been instrumental in helping Everest Holdings secure government contracts for green building projects. I felt a surge of pride as Marcus seamlessly integrated into the conversation with people who understood and appreciated his professional expertise. How did you two meet? Angela Foster asked with the curiosity of someone who loved romantic stories. Marcus squeezed my hand gently. Professional conference on sustainable building materials in Denver. Martha was presenting research on solar integration in commercial construction that completely revolutionized my understanding of energy-efficient design. He was the only person in the audience who asked intelligent questions about my cost-benefit analysis. I added, remembering that day with perfect clarity. I was immediately impressed by her combination of technical knowledge and practical business sense. Marcus continued. Most architects focus on theoretical design elements, but Martha understood the economic realities that make or break construction projects. Mayor Johnson leaned forward with interest. Mr. Chen, your sustainable design elements were a major factor in the city's decision to award the development contract to Martha. The environmental impact projections were exceptional. We've been developing those techniques together for over a year, Marcus explained. Martha's construction experience combined with my architectural training created innovative solutions that neither of us could have developed independently. Richard finally spoke, his voice subdued but genuinely curious. What kind of innovations? Marcus unrolled the architectural plans he had brought, spreading them across the table next to all the legal documents and business reports. Solar panel integration that reduces energy costs by 60%. He began pointing to specific design elements, rainwater collection systems that eliminate irrigation expenses, geothermal heating and cooling that cuts utility bills in half. The initial construction costs are slightly higher, I added, but the long-term savings make these buildings significantly more profitable for both owners and tenants. Patricia studied the architectural drawings with fascination. These are beautiful designs. They look modern and efficient without being cold or impersonal. That's Martha's influence, Marcus said warmly. She insisted that sustainable buildings should feel welcoming and comfortable, not just environmentally responsible. Brandon looked back and forth between Marcus and me with growing understanding. How long have you two been together? 18 months. I answered, but we've been keeping our relationship private because I knew the family would find ways to interfere or create drama. Jessica looked hurt. Martha, we wouldn't have interfered with your happiness. Really? I asked gently. The same family that excluded me from business meetings would have respected my choice in romantic partners. The uncomfortable silence that followed answered my question more clearly than words could have. Marcus pulled out a small velvet box from his jacket pocket and the entire room held its breath. Actually, he said, dropping to one knee beside my chair, I've been waiting for the right moment when your family would finally understand your incredible worth. My heart stopped completely as he opened the box to reveal a stunning engagement ring with a diamond surrounded by smaller stones that sparkled like captured starlight. Martha Wellington. He said, his voice clear and confident, "You are the most brilliant, capable, and inspiring woman I've ever known. You've built an empire while maintaining your integrity, overcome discrimination while keeping your compassion, and achieved success while staying true to your values." Tears streamed down my cheeks as he continued his proposal in front of my entire family and half the city government. "Will you marry me and let me spend the rest of my life supporting your dreams and celebrating your achievements?" "Yeah," I whispered then louder. "Yes, absolutely yes." The room erupted in cheers and applause as Marcus slipped the ring onto my finger and stood to kiss me thoroughly. Patricia rushed over to embrace both of us. "Welcome to the family, Marcus. Martha has chosen wisely." Even Richard stood and shook Marcus's hand with something approaching genuine warmth. "Congratulations to you both." Mayor Johnson raised her champagne glass again. "To Martha and Marcus, a partnership that will undoubtedly create amazing things together." As everyone toasted our engagement, I realized that this moment represented the perfect synthesis of personal happiness and professional success. I had found love with someone who valued my ambitions and supported my goals while simultaneously proving to my family that I could achieve anything I set my mind to accomplish. The celebration of our engagement was interrupted by yet another arrival, but this time the newcomers were clearly expected by Thomas and David. A team of 3 attorneys entered carrying leather briefcases and wearing the satisfied expressions of lawyers who had just won significant victories. Martha called the lead attorney a distinguished woman in her 50s, wearing an immaculate navy blue suit. "I have excellent news to report." Thomas stood and gestured toward the newcomers. "Everyone, this is Patricia Stevens, senior partner at Stevens Martinez and Associates, the law firm that has been handling all legal challenges to Martha's acquisition of Wellington and Sons." Patricia Stevens set her briefcase on our increasingly crowded dining room table and pulled out a thick folder sealed with official court stamps. "As of 4:30 this afternoon," she announced with professional satisfaction, "every legal challenge to the Wellington and Sons acquisition has been dismissed by 3 different courts." Richard's face went through another series of color changes as the implications sank in. "3 different courts?" he asked weakly. "You hired 4 different law firms to challenge the sale," Patricia Stevens explained, consulting her notes. "Morrison and Associates filed a motion claiming mental incompetence during contract signing. Williams Legal Group argued that the sale price was below market value, constituting fraud. Henderson and partners claimed procedural irregularities in the contract execution." David pulled out his tablet and began displaying court documents on our dining room projector. "All 3 cases were dismissed with prejudice, meaning they cannot be refiled." The second attorney, a younger man with prematurely gray hair, stepped forward. "I'm James Martinez. We also successfully defended against Richard's attempt to claim that Martha used insider information to manipulate the sale." "Insider information?" Jessica asked. "Your father argued that Martha's knowledge of Wellington and Sons' financial problems constituted unfair advantage in negotiations," James Martinez explained. "The court ruled that publicly available information gathered through legitimate research cannot be considered insider trading." The third attorney, a woman about my age wearing designer glasses, opened her briefcase. "I'm Sarah Chen, and I handled the environmental compliance aspects of the case." She pulled out EPA and OSHA reports with court stamps attached. Richard's lawyers tried to argue that Martha's acquisition was invalid because she knew about federal violations and failed to disclose them to the seller. But that argument backfired spectacularly. Patricia Stevens continued with obvious satisfaction. "The court ruled that a buyer has no legal obligation to inform a seller about violations the seller should have known about through routine compliance monitoring." Thomas raised his wine glass with a smile. In other words, Richard's own negligence in failing to track federal violations made it impossible for him to claim Martha acted improperly by discovering them. Marcus squeezed my hand supportively as the legal victories piled up. The most significant ruling, Sarah Chen announced, came from federal district court regarding the discrimination lawsuit. She pulled out a thick document bearing federal court seals. Judge Patricia Williams ruled that Martha's evidence of systematic gender-based discrimination constitutes a clear violation of equal protection principles. "What does that mean practically?" Patricia asked. It means Martha's emotional damages claim has been upheld in full, James Martinez explained. The court awarded damages for pain and suffering, lost business opportunities, and psychological harm caused by systematic exclusion from family business activities. I felt a surge of vindication as the legal system formally recognized what I had endured for years. "How much in damages?" Brandon asked quietly. Patricia Stevens consulted her papers. The court awarded Martha $2.7 million in compensatory damages, plus another $1.8 million in punitive damages designed to punish discriminatory behavior. $4.5 million. Richard's voice was barely audible. Which brings us to the final piece of good news. Thomas announced pulling out one more official document. The acquisition paperwork has been finalized and recorded with the Colorado Secretary of State. David switched the projector to display the official corporate registration documents. Effective immediately, Martha Wellington is the sole owner and chief executive officer of Wellington & Sons Construction, now operating as a wholly owned subsidiary of Everest Holdings. I looked at the official documents confirming my ownership of the company that had excluded me for so many years. The irony was both bitter and sweet. "The sale price has been adjusted," Sarah Chen announced, to reflect the legal damages awarded to Martha. She handed me a check that made everyone in the room gasp audibly. $45.5 million, Patricia Stevens explained. $50 million sale price minus $4.5 million in legal damages equals Martha's payment to Richard for the company assets. Richard stared at the check as if it were written in a foreign language. "Of course," James Martinez added with a slight smile. "That's before taxes, attorney fees, and outstanding business debts are deducted." David pulled up another spreadsheet on the projector. After all deductions, Richard's net proceeds from the sale total approximately $18.7 million. $18.7 million. Richard repeated clearly, struggling to process the mathematics. "Which sounds like a lot," Thomas interjected, "until you remember that Martha could have bought the company for much less if she had simply waited for the bankruptcy proceedings to begin." Patricia Stevens packed her documents away with professional efficiency. Martha chose to pay fair market value despite Richard's financial difficulties and legal violations. She could have acquired Wellington & Sons for a fraction of the sale price through foreclosure proceedings. The weight of this revelation settled over the room like morning fog. I had paid Richard far more than his company was actually worth, essentially giving him an undeserved financial windfall despite years of discrimination and exclusion. Marcus leaned over to whisper in my ear, "You're remarkably generous to someone who treated you so poorly. Sometimes being right is more satisfying than being vindictive," I whispered back. Patricia Stevens shook hands with everyone before preparing to leave. "Congratulations, Martha. You've handled this entire situation with extraordinary grace and professionalism." As the lawyers departed, I looked around the room at my family's stunned faces. The legal victories had confirmed what I already knew. My success was legitimate. My methods were ethical, and my treatment had been unjustifiably discriminatory. Justice had been served both legally and personally. The departure of the legal team left our dining room feeling suddenly quiet and empty, despite being filled with people. The weight of everything that had been revealed hung in the air like incense, heavy with significance and impossible to ignore. Jessica was the first to break the silence. She stood slowly from her chair, walked around the table, and stopped directly in front of me. Her eyes were red from crying, but her voice was steady and clear. "Martha," she began, her hands trembling slightly, "I owe you an apology that's about 20 years overdue." I looked up at my sister, seeing vulnerability in her expression that I hadn't witnessed since we were children. "I've spent most of my adult life being jealous of you," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "Jealous of your intelligence, your work ethic, your ability to see solutions where everyone else saw problems." Patricia reached for tissues from the sideboard as Jessica's confession continued. Instead of celebrating your achievements or learning from your example, I protected my own insecurity by supporting Dad's unfair treatment of you. I told myself you were too ambitious, too driven, too focused on proving yourself. She wiped tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. But the truth is, I was ashamed of my own mediocrity. It was easier to diminish your accomplishments than to face the fact that I had wasted my potential on shopping and social events while you were building something extraordinary. The honesty in her voice was heartbreaking and healing at the same time. "Jessica," I said gently, "you don't have to." "Yes, I do," she interrupted firmly. "You deserve to hear this, and I need to say it. You are the most capable person in this family, and instead of being proud of you, I spent years trying to make you feel small so I could feel better about myself." Brandon had been sitting silently during Jessica's confession, but now he stood and walked over to join us. "My turn," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Martha, I've been living in your shadow since we were kids, and I handled it in the worst possible way." He looked down at his hands as he spoke. "Every time you got straight A's while I struggled with C's, every time you solved problems that stumped me, every time Dad compared us, and I came up short, I resented you instead of trying to improve myself." The pain in his voice was genuine and raw. "I started gambling because I felt pressured to succeed like you, but I didn't have your intelligence or your work ethic. Instead of accepting that we have different strengths and finding my own path, I tried to get rich quick and prove I was just as successful as my brilliant sister." Brandon's voice broke slightly. "I stole from Jessica because I was drowning in debt and too proud to ask for help. I was ashamed to admit that my little sister was smarter and more capable than I would ever be. I stood and faced both of my siblings feeling a mixture of sadness and hope. I never wanted to compete with either of you," I said honestly. "I just wanted to be included, to be valued for who I am instead of dismissed because of who I'm not." Jessica reached for my hands. "We can't change the past, but we can do better going forward. Would you help me figure out how to use my social skills and community connections in a way that actually matters?" The request surprised me with its sincerity and self-awareness. "I've been thinking about the community outreach component of your development projects," she continued. "I know everyone in this town, and I understand how to talk to people from different backgrounds. Maybe there's a way I could help ensure that local residents actually benefit from the changes you're bringing." The idea was brilliant and showed genuine insight into her own strengths. "Community liaison and public relations coordinator," I said immediately. "Someone who can bridge the gap between development plans and neighborhood concerns." Jessica's face lit up with the first genuine smile I'd seen from her all day. "You think I could actually be good at that?" "I think you could be exceptional at it," I answered honestly. "You have natural people skills that can't be taught or learned from textbooks." Brandon shifted nervously beside us. "What about me? I know I've messed up everything I've touched lately, but I want to find a way to contribute something positive." I studied my brother's face, seeing genuine remorse and determination where I used to see only entitlement and excuses. "You've always been good with mechanical problems," I observed. "Remember how you used to fix everyone's bicycles when we were kids?" He nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Everest Holdings manages millions of dollars worth of construction equipment across 4 states. We need someone who understands machinery, can diagnose problems quickly, and can coordinate maintenance schedules to prevent costly breakdowns." Brandon's eyes widened with interest. "Equipment maintenance supervisor, regional equipment manager, us," I corrected. "Someone who travels between job sites, ensures everything is running properly, and develops preventive maintenance protocols that save money and prevent accidents." For the first time in years, Brandon looked excited about a professional opportunity. "That's actually something I could be good at." "More than good," I assured him. "You could probably save us hundreds of thousands of dollars annually through proper equipment management." Patricia had been watching this conversation with tears streaming down her face. "This is what I always hoped for," she said softly. "My children supporting each other instead of competing. Richard, who had been silent during the sibling reconciliation, finally spoke up. "Martha, I don't know how to begin apologizing for the damage I've caused." I turned to face my father, seeing a broken man who was finally confronting the consequences of his prejudices. "You can start," I said carefully, "by acknowledging that your treatment of me was wrong and committing to do better going forward." Richard nodded slowly. "My treatment of you was wrong. Fundamentally, completely, inexcusably wrong. I let my outdated beliefs about women blind me to your exceptional abilities, and I hurt someone I should have been proud of." The words were a beginning, though we both knew that rebuilding trust would take time and consistent action. "I don't expect forgiveness overnight," he continued, "but I hope you'll give me the chance to learn how to be a better father." I looked around at my family, seeing genuine remorse and hope for the first time in years. The healing process would be long and difficult, but at least we were finally ready to begin. As the emotional weight of family reconciliation settled over us, Marcus squeezed my hand and gave me an encouraging smile. There was one more revelation I had been waiting to share, and the timing finally felt right. Since we're all being honest about important life changes, I began my heart racing with nervous excitement. Marcus and I have some news that affects the future of everything we've been discussing tonight. Patricia looked at us with sudden maternal intuition. "Martha, are you?" I nodded, placing my free hand over my still flat stomach. "We're expecting our first child. I'm 8 weeks pregnant." The room erupted in congratulations and excitement. Patricia immediately stood to embrace both Marcus and me. Tears of joy, replacing the tears of sadness that had dominated the evening. "A grandchild," she exclaimed, her face lighting up with pure happiness. "This is the best news of the entire day." Jessica rushed over to hug me tightly. "Martha, this is incredible. When is the baby due?" Early July, Marcus answered, his pride evident in every word. "We found out 3 weeks ago and have been planning how to structure our business operations around becoming parents." Thomas raised his glass in another toast. "To the next generation of the Wellington family." As everyone celebrated, I pulled out one final folder from my briefcase. Which brings me to the most important part of tonight's revelations. The future we're building isn't just about correcting past mistakes. It's about creating something better for our children. I opened the folder to reveal architectural plans and corporate structure documents that represented months of careful planning. Marcus and I have been designing a business model that prevents the kind of discrimination and favoritism that damaged our family. I explained, spreading the documents across the table. David connected his laptop to display our corporate organizational chart. Everest Holdings is being restructured as a family-owned business with explicit policies against gender discrimination, nepotism, and unfair treatment based on birth order or personal relationships. "What does that mean practically?" Brandon asked with genuine curiosity. Marcus pulled out our detailed planning documents. "It means that when our children are old enough to consider joining the family business, their opportunities will be based entirely on their interests, abilities, and merit. No automatic assumptions about who's capable of what based on gender," I added firmly. "No favoritism for sons over daughters or older children over younger ones." Patricia studied the organizational charts with fascination. "How do you prevent those problems structurally?" "Multiple pathways into the business," Marcus explained, pointing to different divisions on the chart. "Construction management, architectural design, environmental consulting community, development, equipment, management, and financial planning. Each division has its own leadership track and advancement criteria." I continued. "Someone who's brilliant with numbers but hates construction sites can succeed in financial planning. Someone who loves building things but struggles with paperwork can excel in project management." Thomas nodded approvingly. "A merit-based system that accommodates different strengths and interests." I pulled out another set of documents. "We're also establishing an educational foundation to provide scholarships for young women entering construction engineering and architecture programs. The Martha Wellington Foundation for Women in Building. David announced, displaying the foundation's mission statement on our projector. "Martha," Jessica whispered, "you're naming it after yourself." "Actually," Marcus said with a smile, "it's being named after our daughter. We decided that if we're having a girl, she should grow up knowing that other women have fought for her opportunities." "And if you're having a boy," Brandon asked, "then he'll grow up understanding that his success should never come at the expense of someone else's opportunities," I answered firmly. Patricia wiped away fresh tears. "You're creating the kind of family business I always hoped we could have." I pulled out one final document, this one showing architectural plans for a new corporate headquarters. The Everest Holdings campus will include on-site childcare facilities, flexible work arrangements for parents, and family-friendly policies that support both mothers and fathers. "You're building a corporate culture that actually supports families," Patricia observed. "Because I never want our children to feel like they have to choose between professional success and personal fulfillment," Marcus explained. "Martha shouldn't have to prove she can balance motherhood and business leadership. The business should be structured to support her in both roles." Richard spoke quietly from his corner of the table. "You're building everything I failed to create." I looked at my father with compassion rather than anger. "I'm building on the foundation Grandpa Wellington established, the same foundation that gave you opportunities. I'm just making sure those opportunities extend to everyone in the family." Thomas pulled out his calendar. "When do you want to begin implementing these structural changes?" "Immediately," I answered. "The new corporate policies go into effect January 1st, and construction on the family campus begins next spring." David scrolled through implementation timelines on his tablet. "The childcare facility will be completed before the baby arrives, and the flexible work arrangements are already being tested at 3 Everest Holdings locations." Marcus squeezed my hand as he looked around the room. "We want our child to grow up in a family that celebrates everyone's achievements and supports everyone's dreams." I placed both hands on my stomach, imagining the future we were creating. This baby will never wonder whether their gender makes them less valuable or less capable. They'll never feel excluded from family discussions or dismissed because of outdated prejudices. Patricia stood and raised her glass one more time. "To Martha and Marcus, who are creating the family business, we should have been all along." As everyone toasted our future, I felt a profound sense of completion. The empire I had built to prove my worth would now serve to provide opportunities for the next generation. Justice had evolved into hope, and healing had become the foundation for something entirely new. 1 year later, I stood in the kitchen of our new home, a sprawling ranch-style house with panoramic views of the Rocky Mountains, putting the finishing touches on what would become our new family Thanksgiving tradition. The smell of roasted turkey filled the air, but this year felt completely different from the chaos and confrontation of the previous November. My 6-month-old daughter, Sarah Patricia, Wellington Chen, gurgled happily in her bouncer, her dark eyes tracking the movement of autumn leaves outside the kitchen window. She had Marcus's gentle spirit and my determined chin, a perfect combination that already suggested she would be a force to be reckoned with. "She's going to be walking before we know it," Patricia said, leaning over to tickle Sarah's tiny fingers, "and probably running the company by the time she's 5. I laughed, adjusting the apron that had become necessary since becoming a nursing mother. "She can run whatever she wants, but first she has to learn to sleep through the night." The past year had been a whirlwind of positive changes that sometimes felt almost too good to be true. The downtown revitalization project was ahead of schedule and under budget, creating exactly the kind of economic opportunities we had promised. Jessica had proven to be a natural community liaison, organizing town halls and neighborhood meetings that ensured local residents felt heard and included in the development process. Martha Jessica called from the dining room. "The Historical Society president just called to thank you again for the preservation work on Main Street. She said the Victorian storefronts look better now than they did in 1895. Brandon appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing oil-stained coveralls and a satisfied grin. Just finished the maintenance check on the excavation equipment for the Phase 2 construction site. Everything's running perfectly, and we're saving about $15,000 a month on repair costs with the new preventive maintenance schedule. His transformation had been remarkable. 9 months of sobriety, steady work with clear responsibilities, and the respect of crew members who valued his mechanical expertise had given him confidence I hadn't seen since childhood. Amanda had moved back in with him last month, and they were talking about starting a family of their own. The community center groundbreaking ceremony is scheduled for next Monday. I announced stirring gravy and bouncing Sarah's bouncer with my foot. The mayor wants us all there for the ribbon cutting. Patricia emerged from the dining room carrying Sarah's high chair. I still can't believe how much has changed in 1 year. The changes were visible everywhere. Patricia's catering business had become so successful that she was considering opening a second location. Her divorce from Richard had been finalized 6 months ago, and while it had been emotionally difficult, she seemed years younger and infinitely happier. Richard himself appeared in the kitchen doorway looking uncertain about his welcome, despite my repeated invitations. The therapy sessions we had all been attending both individually and as a family were slowly rebuilding trust and communication patterns that had been broken for years. "Martha," he said quietly, "I brought the employee satisfaction surveys you requested. Morale at Wellington and Sons is at an all-time high, and productivity has increased 37% since you implemented the new safety protocols." His transformation had been the most dramatic of all. Confronted with the reality of his prejudices and their consequences, Richard had committed himself to understanding why his beliefs had been so harmful. He now attended monthly workshops on gender equality in the workplace and had become an advocate for women in construction within industry associations. "The Women in Building Scholarship recipients will be here for dessert," I reminded everyone. 5 young women starting engineering and architecture programs next fall, all from local families. Marcus entered through the back door carrying a bottle of wine and the latest architectural plans for our next project. The sustainable housing development in Fort Collins just received final approval. 60 families will have affordable, energy-efficient homes by next Christmas. He kissed me softly and then lifted Sarah from her bouncer, marveling as he did every day at the tiny person we had created together. "And how's my brilliant daughter today?" "Brilliant and demanding," I answered with a smile, "just like her parents." The doorbell began ringing as our guests arrived for what had become an elaborate Thanksgiving celebration. Thomas and David came first, followed by the city officials who had become genuine friends over the past year. Jake Morrison, our head foreman, arrived with his family, followed by Carol Henderson and several other employees who had become part of our extended chosen family. As we gathered around the expanded dining room table, I looked at the faces surrounding us and felt overwhelming gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this moment. The pain and confrontation of last year's Thanksgiving had ultimately led to healing and growth that none of us could have imagined. "Before we eat," I said, standing with Sarah in my arms, "I want to share some exciting news about our next major expansion." I handed Sarah to Marcus and pulled out a folder containing agreements that represented months of negotiation and planning. Everest Holdings has just acquired development rights for a mixed-use project in Phoenix, Arizona, $250 million in sustainable development that will create over 1,000 jobs and provide affordable housing for 800 families. The room erupted in cheers and applause. "But more importantly," I continued, "we've structured this project as a pilot program for our new apprenticeship initiative. Young people from local communities will receive paid training in construction trades, environmental engineering, and project management while working on the development." Thomas raised his glass. "To Martha, who continues to prove that success is even sweeter when it lifts up others." As everyone toasted our expansion, I felt Sarah grip my finger with her tiny hand and realized that she was growing up in exactly the kind of world I had dreamed of creating. A world where her opportunities would be limited only by her interests and abilities, where her gender would be celebrated rather than seen as an obstacle, and where family meant support and encouragement rather than competition and exclusion. "One more thing," Marcus announced, pulling out his phone. "I just received confirmation that Martha has been selected as the keynote speaker for the National Women in Construction Conference next spring." The applause was even louder this time. "The first woman under 30 to be chosen for that honor," David added proudly. I looked around the table at all the people who had supported my journey, challenged my assumptions, and helped me build something larger than I could have imagined alone. 3 years ago, I felt excluded from my own family and dismissed by the industry I loved. I said my voice emotional but strong. Today, I'm surrounded by people who believe in my vision and support my dreams. The best part isn't the business success or the financial rewards. It's knowing that we've created something that will provide opportunities for future generations. Patricia stood and raised her glass. To Martha, who turned rejection into resilience and built an empire on the foundation of fairness and respect. As we began passing dishes around the table, Sarah made her first real attempt at crawling, determined to reach the basket of dinner rolls. Her persistence and focus reminded me so much of myself that everyone laughed. "She's definitely going to keep us on our toes," Marcus observed with pride. "Just like her mother," Richard added, and for the first time in my adult life, it sounded like a compliment rather than a criticism. As we enjoyed our meal and shared stories of the year's accomplishments, I realized that this was what victory actually looked like. Not the moment of dramatic revelation when I announced my ownership of Everest Holdings, but this quiet gathering of people who respected each other, supported each other's dreams, and worked together to build something meaningful. The little girl who had once felt worthless because of her gender was now raising a daughter who would never question her own value. The young woman who had been excluded from family business decisions was now creating opportunities for hundreds of families. The ambitious entrepreneur who had built an empire to prove her worth had discovered that the greatest success was using that empire to lift others up. As we finished our meal and prepared for dessert, I looked around the table one more time, grateful beyond words for the journey that had brought us all to this place of healing, growth, and hope. Sarah began babbling in her high chair, her voice rising above the adult conversation, as if she had something important to add to our discussion. Maybe she was already planning her own business empire, or perhaps she was simply happy to be surrounded by people who loved her unconditionally. Either way, she was growing up in a family that would support whatever dreams she chose to pursue. Have you ever had to fight for recognition in your own family or workplace because of your gender age or other factors beyond your control? Share your experiences in the comments below and let me know how you overcame those challenges. Your story might inspire someone else who's facing similar struggles. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like to show your support for women who refuse to accept limitations others try to impose on them. Subscribe for more stories about turning rejection into resilience and building success on your own terms. And please share this story with someone who needs to hear that their worth isn't determined by other people's narrow expectations. Thank you for joining me on this journey of transformation and triumph. May you always remember that your dreams are valid, your ambitions are valuable, and your success is inevitable when you refuse to accept anything less than the respect you deserve.